There we go. So welcome everybody. So my name is Travis Longcore. I'm the president of Los Angeles Audubon. This is one of our monthly evening programs. I want to welcome everybody here online and already appreciate those of you putting your cities and neighborhoods in the chat. We've got people across the basin and currently somebody in Tennessee. So we really appreciate you staying up late and joining us. I will mention, depending on how you learned about this, you can be on our mailing list. You could have seen it on Facebook. If you'd like to be on our mailing list and you aren't, just go to our website, laaudubon.org. Pretty much every page at the bottom has a subscribe form, and just put your email in there and we'll get you the announcements and our newsletter and all that good stuff. We also have in-person opportunities. We've kept our evening programs in the digital space here because frankly people don't want to fight traffic as much as they used to, and so we found that we're able to reach more people and get us build a broader community that way. Next month, if you're interested, our program in December is actually going to be tree care for birds. So from an arborist, talking about how to manage trees in the landscape for safety, but also for birds at the same time. And that's something that we at LA Audubon have been involved in for many, many years, including creating bird-friendly tree trimming guidelines that are on our website. Also welcome anybody who wants to become a LA Audubon member. We have chapter memberships that are additional to your National Audubon membership if you're a member of National. And there's a button on our website on the upper right says Join Renew, and we really welcome you to do that. It helps us pay the bills and pay the insurance, to be quite honest, to be able to offer public programs and offer them for free. So we appreciate everybody who has done that and who's renewed and participates that way. So without much further ado here, I want to welcome Andy Birch for our presentation tonight. Andy's been a birder in LA for at least 25 years, and I'm going to guess some years before that, perhaps other places as well. He also helps us out a bit with conservation issues at LA Audubon, has kept his eye on things like the LA River and the Silver Lake Reservoir and written some things there, and we really appreciate that. He is, as you will have seen already in our announcement and see tonight, a incredibly talented and accomplished artist as well, including bird art. And I don't even know the full breadth of all the art that you do, but I'm sure that's a whole nother interesting discussion that we could have. And he's gotten into monitoring nocturnal flight calls of birds, and this really fits with our theme here this fall, having heard about Bear Divide. Last month and earlier this year, heard about the impact of light pollution on nocturnal migrants. We've kind of been pursuing that because it aligns with one of our areas that we care about, and we've been sort of slowly encouraging the city of LA to take up, which is being able to have some bird-friendly guidelines for building and lighting. There's a ordinance being proposed right now, the wildlife ordinance in Los Angeles, that would have some lighting guidelines in it. And we, of course, would love to see something like what's going on other places in the country that do a little bit more for their migrating birds. But part of being able to do that is understanding what's there in the first place and letting people know that there are birds migrating overhead at night in Los Angeles, and you can hear them. And I know far less than I want to about this topic right now, so I'm seriously looking forward to this presentation. So Andy, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Travis. Go share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Oh, I think we see your screen, Travis. Do we? Can everybody see? Here, I'm going to share. I'm going to try sharing my screen again. How does that look? Can you see that, Travis? You're muted.
This time we got your notes and not the PowerPoint. So we got your PDF.
Oh, really? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so
Stop.
we're looking at your PDF with your notes.
There we go. I'm going to try one more time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
three's a chart.
Here's my PowerPoint. Okay, do you see
There
that?
we got it. Yes.
Good. Sorry for the false start, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So if I told you that in the spring and fall of 2020, from my yard, there were solitary and spotted sandpipers, American avocet, blackneck stilts, Virginia rail, American coot, green heron, several hundred Swainson's thrush, not to mention multiple grasshopper, Savannah sparrows, you would think that I likely had a yard near the coast, perhaps overlooking a marsh and or near some migration hotspot, maybe not in LA County at all. Well, actually, I live in Los Feliz, less than 1 mile from the noisy 5 freeway and a half a mile from the busy Los Feliz Boulevard, which is the main cut through from Hollywood to the east side of the city. I'm on the southern edge of Griffith Park, about a mile from the LA River, but other than that, nothing remarkable geographically about my location at all. I recorded actually all of these species as nocturnal migrants calling over my house in a niche area of birding that has been gaining more and more popularity over the last couple of decades, called nocturnal flight call recording, NFC. NFC for short gives us a little window into the birds migrating over us as we're in our beds asleep. Now, most birds migrate at night, and it's something not a lot of people, especially non-birders, are aware of. And just because you live in a noisy, over-urbanized, overlit city doesn't mean it won't be good for recording these migrants. In fact, the more concrete urbanization and more light pollution you have around you, unfortunately, it may actually produce better results. This is the famous Dodgers goose, the greater white-fronted goose that recently landed in the middle of a game. I know Travis had posted about it on Facebook as well and social media. And it sort of helped to bring night migration to the minds of the general population. This bird was no doubt migrating at night, and it was drawn in by the stadium lights while it was on its migration. Attracted by those bright lights, it saw some beautiful green grass and decided to stop in and rest. On the right is a typical spectrogram that I would record from my house. Now, if we were in person, I would play this for you. When I've tried to play these audio recordings through web platforms like Zoom and Blue Jeans, unfortunately, they're very clever and they filter out all the sirens and the train noises, and you end up with basically a nice, clean, blank, silent recording, which is no use at all. So instead, here is just the visual representation of all that human noise that I pick up when I'm recording in my area. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. I hope you can. These two peaks, these sort of vertical lines here, these are train sirens. This sort of regular rhythmic noise here, those are police sirens. Sorry, those are train horns. These are police sirens. And this just general dark red area at the bottom here, that's all the low end rumbling of city traffic, the I-5 freeway. And so you may think, well, it's completely futile trying to record bird sounds in such a noisy urban scape. But the birds are actually literally migrating high, and they're calling above all of these noises. They're calling at a frequency above a lot of this human-generated noise. So actually, you may be able to see some of these little marks on the recorder here. There's a couple up the top. These are sparrows, Savannah white-crowned sparrows. We have some Swainson's thrushes here, which are above those sirens. There's actually a barn owl here, and we even have a Virginia rail just calling here. So a lot of the birds are actually not being we're not losing our ability to hear them when we're doing these recordings just because we're in a busy, noisy city. So how do we get to this point where we've got amateur birders like myself and professional ornithologists who are putting microphones out at night to try and record the night skies? Well, this is Machias Seal Island off Maine, and this photo is by Ralph Eldridge. All those bright yellow dots are warblers. An amazing nocturnal migration that got halted by poor weather, and the lights drew the birds in to find refuge. This and the next slide I'm going to show an example of when nocturnal migration goes wrong or hits a speed bump, for example, during bad weather, causing these sorts of fallouts. For me, many people talk about spark birds, but actually for me, it wasn't a particular bird or a species that really got me hooked on birding. For me, it was migration, just the act of migration. Coming from the UK, an island, migration ensured that I could never get bored as the ebb and flow of the avian landscape changed from one day to the next during spring and fall. So a few years ago, when I found out I could actually see this hidden nocturnal migration, I was instantly intrigued by it. Similar amazing nocturnal fallouts occur on the other side of the Atlantic as well. This is from German ornithologist Martin Grimm, who was on a boat in the Baltic in October 2015. Again, just highlighting the amazing feats of endurance all migrants, especially nocturnal migrants, undertake. And for many of us, it's the only insight we actually sort of get into nocturnal migration is actually when it goes wrong and there's some sort of fallout event. This sort of crazy pictures we see here on the left is a Eurasian sparrowhawk that's eating a Eurasian siskin while another Eurasian siskin sits on its back, just looking for any type of place to rest. And then in the middle here, we've got a bird which is a brambling, which is just a finch. They don't usually eat meat, but this bird is obviously desperate and is eating one of its colleagues that's unfortunately had a sorry fate. So for centuries, Northern Hemisphere scholars speculated about whether bird migration existed at all, and they wondered whether their familiar summer birds actually went in the winter. A popular theory was transmutation, speculating that birds didn't go anywhere but changed into completely different species or animals. There were other fanciful notions of birds flying to the moon and back on their seasonal migrations, and there were stories of swallows found hibernating at the bottom of lakes. Indeed, the swallow hibernating theory persisted in some circles as late as the 19th century. But it was the German arrow stork on the bottom left there in the early 19th century, which was injured by an arrow while wintering in Africa before returning to Europe with the arrow still stuck in its body. This helped cement the almost unbelievable evidence that these northern European birds were flying to Africa and back every year. Obviously, 150 years on, it's now well understood that birds do indeed migrate, many undertaking incredible physical feats in terms of distance covered and navigation. Bird banding to track migration and raptor watching sites and other diurnal migration watch points were appearing in North America and Europe in the early 20th century. And it was also discovered with the advent of World War II radar that it was not only detecting water droplets, but it could also pick up biological targets such as birds. Other improving technology in the latter part of the century gave us new insights and inventive ways to learn more about migration. Now we've progressed to satellite tracking and the advent of tiny transmitters and other high-tech devices. Scientists are uncovering some of these mysteries of migration. So some of you may have already heard Ryan Terrell's talk about Bear Divide, and many of you may have heard about that incredibly important place where you can actually see visible migration during the day, the daytime hours. This is one of the most popular and obvious ways that birders and ornithologists track migration is, sitting at a fixed spot, watching as masses of birds fly in the same general direction, either singly or in groups to or from their wintering grounds. Bear Divide in LA County is a great example of this, and sometimes huge movements can be observed, like the 10,000 birds witnessed by Christine and Ryan Terrell on April 22nd, 2020. And there were also very impressive numbers the following day with other observers. So while it's now very popular to watch birds migrating in the daytime, how on earth can we amateur birders experience bird migration at night? Well, there are two main approaches to viewing nocturnal migration. You can either sit outside, perhaps at your favorite visible migration spot. You can watch the moon for passing silhouettes. Perhaps you can even use an infrared camera. Some people now start to use those as the price of those have come down. And you could listen to the birds calling overhead. You can also check out Cornell's birdcast radar to also see how busy it's going to be, or check for when the full moon is going to be. Or you can leave recording gear outside, giving you the opportunity to check identifications later, or simply because you need to sleep at night. In fact, the strongest nocturnal flight call activity often occurs towards the end of the night when very few people are awake. Previously, to study this area, you needed expensive sound recording equipment, a lot of technical expertise, and a lot of time. Now, with the advent of smartphones, cheap digital recorders, free software to create spectrograms, the ability to record these birds over our apartments, houses, balconies, and yards is actually now within all of our reach. The indigenous people of the LA region, the Tongva, would have had a connected relationship with bird migration, and they were likely well aware of the nocturnal calls of migrating birds, especially waterfowl and the larger birds. So they would have been the first humans to note nocturnal flight calls in our area. But in terms of published data, it was Libby in 1896 that published the first record of the night flight call phenomenon, logging 3,600 calls from 5 hours of listening to migrating birds. The concept of monitoring nocturnal flight calls existed in the 1950s and 60s, but the labor and equipment was a major impediment. Graeber and Cochrane produced some of the first reel-to-reel recordings in the late 50s, and these pictures here are from Graeber and Cochrane's 1959 paper. The middle illustration shows a theoretical diagram of the reach of their microphone. There was someone called Bill Gunn who also recorded night migrants from a Toronto skyscraper in the late 50s, and there were others recording in the 70s and 80s sporadically. But it was a pizza delivery boy and University of Minnesota student, Bill Evans, who had a life-changing moment while camping at a state park when he was witness to an incredible nocturnal passage of migrants, and he dedicated his life from that point on to nocturnal flight call recordings. He produced a cassette of thrush calls that was heavily bootlegged and found its way into the hands of every serious North American birder. He recorded on a hi-fi VCR up until the early 2000s, when he was then able to record to a computer. Not content with one listening station, he built a network of VCR stations across New York State in the early 90s. Bill has devoted 35 years to what he has described as an addiction to trying to ID and see what is happening in the skies at night. By the mid-90s, he was involved in the software development for automated flight call detection, and then he teamed up with another enthusiast, Michael O'Brien, who spent decades recording the daytime flight calls of migrants at visible migration spots like Cape May, in order to build an identification guide to flight calls of migrants. And then they published their seminal book in 2002, Flight Calls of Migratory Birds of Eastern North America. It's now out of print, but there are recordings available free online. You can see they're there in this picture, building up their library of calls. It's important to do it during the daytime so you can absolutely be certain what it is that you are building your identification based on. Here's the radar from that great day in April 2020, the great day up at Bear Divide. So radar studies have this advantage of being able to detect and quantify birds flying at high altitudes. But a disadvantage is that most birds cannot be identified to species level. When listening to nocturnal migration, it is basically the other way around. We can identify many callers to species level, but it's much more difficult to estimate numbers. And basically impossible to detect birds, obviously, that do not call or they're outside of the range of our hearing or our mics. And high radar reflectivity itself is not always accompanied by high call detections, suggesting that birds flying overhead might not always be detected because they fly too high or they're simply not calling. There also seems to be some data that suggests that not all species are giving calls upon takeoff, but rather several hours later when they're at a migration elevation. So these radar blooms at sunset and for a few hours afterwards may not be detectable on mics because the birds simply aren't calling. Now let's go back to that big visible migration day at Bear Divide I mentioned earlier and look at Birdcast radar. My recordings were not exceptional at all on the 22nd and 23rd. During the morning, I was seeing a little slice of what was being seen at Bear Divide, and it was clear something was happening in my neighborhood, and I was seeing large numbers of birds. But while they were observing 10,000 passerines in the morning at Bear Divide, my nocturnal recordings consisted mostly of Swainson's thrushes and maybe a single azalea bunting. Yet looking at this radar, it was clear there was a lot of nocturnal migration happening. Interestingly, Bear Divide, with all that observer coverage, had only one Swainson's thrush over the entire 2 days. And they never have particularly high counts of that species, even despite the amount of observers coverage that it gets. And that's compared to the hundreds of Swainson's thrushes that I'm picking up on my microphone in Los Feliz. In terms of the other species they see at Bear Divide, flycatchers, vireos, they don't appear to be nocturnal callers, so we wouldn't be picking those up. But tanagers, buntings, grosbeaks, and warblers are, and warblers like Wilson's warbler are a very distinctive flight call, but we weren't really picking those up on my microphone. And there was something like 2,000 Wilsons recorded at Bear Divide on the 23rd. I had double digits in my yard that morning, so it wasn't as if it was a very highly localized passage. It was obviously occurring all over Los Angeles. So are the warblers flying too high to be recorded nocturnally with my equipment? Warbler calls will be faint compared to, say, a Swainson's thrush. Perhaps the warblers are coming down to a lower altitude during the dawn hours and they keep flying where they can be seen by observers. Perhaps the Swainsons are coming down at dawn and staying out of sight as they refuel a nap. But this is one example where nocturnal flight call study will reveal interesting migration data not picked up during the daytime by daytime birders. Most of our understanding of migration comes from visual or audio surveys during, I guess 10 to 12 hours of daylight. But as many birds migrate in the night, many will go undetected during the day if they have secretive habits or they stop in a particular study area. And so it leads to an open question about how much information regarding bird migration is not observed just by doing daytime studies alone. So there are obviously some advantages of being a nocturnal migrant. One is you minimize predation from hawks. Although it should be mentioned that in Europe there is a bat that has been discovered that actually feeds on nocturnal migrant birds. I don't think that's being recorded in North America, but in Europe there seems to be this additional threat for nocturnal migrants. If you migrate at night, you will obviously avoid overheating. And then the advantage is if you migrate at night, you can actually then feed during the day if you're an insect-eating bird, which most of these migrants are. Whereas if you're migrating during the day, you can't feed, and then you are resting at night, but you can't actually refuel. And then the other aspect to this, and there's still a lot that we're learning about migration, is one of the tools that migrant birds use is celestial navigation, and obviously that's a great advantage if you're a nocturnal migrant. So what are these nocturnal flight calls? Well, they are actually just very short calls given by the birds as they migrate. Most species of North America's migrant land birds make their transcontinental flights at night, and many give these short vocalizations as they fly. They include short calls, partial songs, and other sounds. Theories are it helps them to maintain contact in groups like air traffic control. The migration that they're doing is likely very, very complex. And there are some species that don't seem to call at all. Vireos and flycatchers don't seem to make these calls. And they can be given at almost any time of year, but seem to be most prominent during the migration periods in fall and spring. So as I mentioned, the migration is likely very complex indeed. One study recently attached transmitters to Swainson's thrushes, and they did that in the Midwest. There were no mountain passes that these birds had to clear. It's pretty flat. And there was a remarkable amount of altitude change during the course of the night. Most migration researchers have assumed that the nocturnal passerine migrants typically ascend to a chosen altitude, then they fly at or near that altitude until they descend, kind of like a commercial airplane. It's the cheapest, less costly way to use the fuel. Or perhaps they ascend, cruise at a predetermined altitude until they basically run out of fuel and then find somewhere to land. Yet these Swainson's thrushes were changing altitude frequently during the course of the night, which seems a very expensive way to fly and obviously leads to a number of questions. So it seems there is more to it than the simple explanation of ascend, stay the course until descent. They're possibly responding to fine scale variation in atmospheric conditions. Cities and towns can create strong thermals during the day that persist into the beginning of the night, and perhaps they were using the lift from these thermals to increase their altitude without increasing their flight costs. They're also attracted to the lights as well, and especially on those lone communication towers. And they often descend over these areas, after which, the goose is a good example of that, after which they then ascend to a higher altitude. A final possibility is the altitude changes involve orientation or navigation strategies. Bill Evans surmises that, this migration could be a Zen-like experience for these birds. Those earlier visuals I showed of the fallouts in Maine and Baltic Sea, no doubt very stressful events when migration is not going well. But when things are going well and they're flying for hours uninterrupted in pitch black with just the calls of other migrants helping to push them along, Evans surmises, they perhaps are in a zone like a marathon runner. There have been studies that show that the energy use on a migratory flight is not as expensive as expected. And that heart rates rose on ascent and then decreased and actually plateaued during the course of their flight. So one important thing to note is that there are quite a lot of people studying nocturnal flight calls, a lot of amateurs, birders like myself, on the East Coast, the Gulf. Very little is done on the West Coast. In 2020, there was, I think, one station in San Diego, one in LA, if you include mine, and a couple in Monterey County. Those were the only ones I could find for the entire state of California. Whereas if you compare that to the East Coast and even the Midwest, it's far outnumbered, which does mean that we have limited knowledge about what's going on here on the West Coast. It does also mean that a lot of the resources, the identification guides, etc., all have a very Eastern bias to them. And so it actually means that if you're attempting to do it here, you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit and trying to guess, sometimes, what you're doing. It has been very helpful at Bear Divide. Ryan, during one of the first seasons, set up his recorder, and he was recording the daytime calls of these Western warblers because there is really no true identification guide to them. And so that has helped to sort of build a library for anybody who's wanting to try it out here on the West Coast. We've actually got, a number of identification guides going. So, but it's a slow process, and as I say, there's a lot less interest out here than there is back east. But still, these stations were important in the spring. They detected Swainson's thrushes in all of their counties almost a week before the first visual observation of a Swainson's thrush. So these are birds that have previously gone undetected. I mentioned Swainson's thrush before in relation to Bear Divide, how the abundance of this species in my recordings doesn't tally with the visual observations at what is probably the best visible migration hotspot in LA. Swainson's is a super skulky species, so perhaps they're only migrating at night and spending the day hunkered down deep in habitat out of sight. Or perhaps many are not stopping at dawn, but they just keep flying, but do it at a higher altitude, and therefore avoid detection from observers during the day. Still many questions still to answer. And in the fall, these same stations detected significantly more grasshopper sparrows than you would expect. That's another skulky but quite vocal nocturnal migrant. And as Travis had mentioned at the beginning, that it's an educational experience trying to make the public, the general public, city planners aware of nocturnal migration. It's just not something that anybody's generally aware of. So understanding the timing, the magnitude, and species composition of migrating birds is critical for bird conservation, particularly when it comes to assessing populations or potential human-made hazards during migration. For example, knowing exactly when and where birds migrate can help assess where wind turbines, a demonstrated hazard for birds, are placed and when they are operated. Today's nocturnal migrants face a unique hazard with light pollution, particularly in urban centres where lights and tall buildings coexist. The disorienting effects of lights can cause birds to collide into buildings or drive them to exhaustion. forcing them to the ground where they become victims to other hazards such as cats and moving cars. Many of us will have seen these images of nocturnal migrants, confused by city lights, striking buildings, overhead wires. Some communication towers with their red flashing lights kill thousands of birds per night. Bill Evans estimated one tower in Wisconsin is responsible for 120,000 dead birds in 40 years. Audubon, ABC lobbies for lights out campaigns in various cities, and some cities like Chicago have really embraced it. Travis will have more information than me on how LA was doing, but when I had last looked at this, LA was ranked as the 4th most dangerous city in the country for spring migrating birds. Recent studies have shown that birds that use nocturnal flight calls to help navigate are also more likely to collide with lighting buildings compared to other migrating birds that don't produce such calls. The calls of these birds presumably lure other birds in. So I think the more data and detail we can get about nocturnal migrating birds in LA County is only a good thing. And for me personally, as the LA River gets more developed over the next few years, we'll see more and more bridges being built. And I would say let's try and avoid the suspension bridges like this one at Atwater Park, partly funded by tax dollars and an excellent migrant bird killing machine. I see many near misses and strikes during the daylight hours and can only imagine what happens at night as birds drop down into the river. And to add to that, the bridge is also well lit up at night. So perhaps I may have convinced you to think about attempting to help contribute to the data and help build a picture of how to record these birds. I will say the next slides here were loaned to me by Marky Muchler, who is also a LA resident right now and a nocturnal flight call expert. And she had already done a presentation a while ago that she kindly allowed me to borrow. So a lot of the technical stuff here is from hers. I will take all responsibility for mistakes, of course. So how do we hear these things? Well, these calls are given by several birds, and they're not limited to migrant passerines, ducks, rails, shorebirds, herons, and others, all common nocturnal flight call birds. They're most commonly heard from sundown to sunrise during the migration periods. During the night, they usually peak after 11 p.m. and they'll continue until sunrise for a morning flight. So the best time is generally 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. And in order to identify the calls being heard, you must record them. Practice by ear can help to ID some, but certainly not all of them. And the majority of nocturnal flight calls are given in a higher frequency range, meaning that even if you may have a noisy neighborhood, you can still identify most of the calls. So the gear that you need can range from quite a sophisticated microphone that some people will even place in a bucket and put on the roof of their house, through to just reusing a lavalier mic. I have a very small digital recorder that I just put out on my deck. But some people even just use an old iPhone or their iPhone, and they'll just put it in a bag and hang it out their window. So it's as involved as you want to be, and I would probably recommend, if you were going to try this and help contribute, that you probably go for the simplest option, which is probably just putting your phone outside from 11 o'clock for a couple of hours and then seeing what you record. LA Birders has webinars on bird recording, and they can give you advice on equipment and software if you were thinking of getting seriously into it. In general, you want to try and find a quiet place away from air conditioning units, anything that might have electrical interference. And we talked about busy cities. We can't obviously avoid helicopters and sirens, but if you can at least avoid being close to something that's going to ruin your recording with electrical interference through it, you should. And try to record at 48 kilohertz if you have that possibility. And it can be as simple as just leaving your iPhone out on a balcony table, maybe with a charger in it. So certain flight calls are actually easily identifiable by ear and can be learned quite quickly. Thrushes and herons and even some shorebirds. Other flight calls you definitely need to have a recording for. And many of them you will need to leave as just a spur, as a warbler spur or a sparrow spur. So it's very important to be realistic about how much we still don't know at this stage. To identify flight calls from recordings, you need to view the recorded call in what is called a spectrogram. You're seeing some spectrograms here. There's free software. There's something called Audacity. Raven Light, which I think comes from Cornell, is free. And there is also commercial software, Adobe Audition. If you have Adobe Creative Suite already, you can get Adobe Audition for free. And they all work very well at creating and editing spectrograms. The calls we're seeing here are some warblers. These night flight calls are very short. They're typically less than half a second long, and they're in fairly high frequencies, 5 to 9 kilohertz, which does make them especially difficult for the human ear to distinguish, and I would probably say impossible for these ones we're seeing here. They're just too short, too similar, and in such a high frequency that you would need to have them recorded. And then we base our identification on that library of daytime calls that we've recorded. So spectrograms are this visual representation. For musicians, I guess think of it like reading sheet music. It's this visual representation of the sound and its frequencies over time. So there are three main things to look at a spectrogram when we're deciphering the calls. There's the frequency of the sound, the length of the sound, and the type and the shape of the sound as well. Here we have white-crowned and savanna sparrow, which if you were to listen to, and I will play some of these calls in a minute, to your ear, you may feel like there's no difference at all. But when you look at the spectrogram, you can see that white-crowned sparrow gently rises. It's an ascending call. And savanna sparrow goes in completely the opposite direction. It's a descending call. And the lengths are pretty similar, but you can see that there's a different shape to these calls. So on the spectrogram, the y-axis is frequency. So frequency is a measurement of sound waves per second. And it's one of the most important aspects to identifying calls, is it tells you how high or low the call was. Pitch is a subjective human assessment of how high or low a sound may be. So frequency is on this y-axis, and most analysis softwares are either automatically set by kilohertz or you can manually set them to kilohertz. Warbler and sparrow calls are usually between the 6 and 10 kilohertz range. As you can see here, we've got some sparrows and warblers all neatly lying there. Thrushes, herons, rails lie below 5 kilohertz, and as you can see we have Swainson's thrushes, which nearly always are found in that range. We can always ignore noises above 10 kilohertz. These are usually insects, bats, and they are way out of the range of our human hearing. Then on the x-axis we have this number line, it's time. So when a file is either recorded directly or imported into our favorite software, whatever it might be, Audacity, the number line will start at 0. And from here we can actually measure how long the calls are. So while you might be looking at this thinking, well, the sparrows and the warblers look incredibly similar, we can actually measure them, and warblers are always much shorter than sparrows. Sparrows have a longer call, and once you've recorded a few of these, you can actually even see by eye that you're looking at a warbler versus a sparrow. And then you can see Swainson's thrush here is a fairly long calls as well. Then there's the visualization of the type and the shape. So when looking at a call on spectrogram, there are three things to consider in terms of the shape. What direction is it going? Is it going up, down, or is it flat? Does it have multiple frequency bands, or is it just one? Is the call straight, or is it modulated with lots of waves? You can see here Swainson's thrushes, fairly flat. When you get a good recording and you look close, there is a nice little bit of modulation in there, but generally a lot of my recordings are never that good and they look fairly flat. Whereas yellow warbler and Wilson's warbler, you see tons of modulation going there, and fairly consistent pattern as well. Wilson's warbler kind of reminds me of the electrical sort of ohm symbol. It has this sort of peak in the middle, whereas yellow warbler is flat, but both of them have lots of modulation. And these are actually calls that experienced birders can tell by ear. They sound quite buzzy. These modulated calls have a sort of buzzy quality to them. And so in our world of recording nocturnal calls, there's a few bits of jargon that people use. We have the upsweep, where it goes up, the downsweep. We have the double barred or the banded, refers to often multiple bands. And then we have the zeep or the wavy call. Oftentimes, similar groups of birds give similar nocturnal calls. Sparrows, warblers give the upsweeps. Savannah sparrows, and no western warblers give the downsweep. So when you find one of those in your recording, you really don't have any options. It's always going to be a Savannah sparrow. And then there are the zeep calls that lazuli bunting, blue grosbeak, Lincoln sparrow gives. These are not comprehensive, and several calls don't fit into these categories, but it's a good way to sort of lump things into buckets. And also, again, we have to remember that our understanding of Western migrant calls is still very much in its infancy. So I know I said these things don't play well over Zoom and Blue Jeans, but we're going to give it a try. I think Travis told me if I talk through it, maybe you'll be able to hear these. So if you want to hear some of these ridiculously short, high-pitched calls, I'm going to play them now. You might want to turn your volume up. And it's totally okay if you think they all sound the same, or you can't actually hear any of them. But here's a night sky with a few sparrows calling. One after the other, very similar calls. They probably all sound the same. You probably all thought, if you heard those, you probably thought it was the same bird calling over and over. But actually they were different species. And we'll now look at the spectrogram of that same call. Again, I will try and talk through it so that you can hear these. And also there'll be, I think, the name of the bird will be there as well. So first up, we have golden crown, song, savannah, brewers, vesper, Lincolns, chipping, white-crowned fox. All those different species there, they all sounded the same. But you may have noticed that the spectrograms all actually looked a little bit different, enough to the point where we could actually identify them. So even if one of those flies over our yard and we just get that quarter of a second recording, we can actually identify it. Here's a cheat sheet. Obviously, I won't go through it all, but you can see there's quite noticeable differences between a lot of these calls. Savannah sparrow is the only one that downsweeps. We've got buzzy calls there. We've got modulated calls. Brewer's sparrow reminds me of like a musical note. White-crowned sparrow, which is going to be the commonest one you record if you were to put your microphone outside, is fairly distinctive, sort of double-banded upsweep. Longer than Audubon's warbler, that would be the closest call to it. There's probably the three here: song sparrow, fox sparrow, and golden crown sparrow. Right now, people are not feeling like they're safely identifiable, but I'm sure that will change. But as you can see, there is a chance here that you can actually identify these things. And on the warblers, they are very tough. And many are perhaps not safely separable. A lot of these spectrograms here were built from recordings that Ryan had done, and then I did quite a few myself. The pandemic helped me be in my yard and on my deck, and in the early mornings I was recording a lot of these warblers as they were going through and being able to put a name to them because I could see them. So a combination of those recordings and also recordings at Bear Divide has sort of helped us build a bit of an ID guide. I think, to feel really confident, we need a lot more recordings. It's still very much in its infancy, but we're slowly getting to the point where maybe there are discernible differences between some of these Western warblers, so that we can actually sort of meaningfully, make IDs on some of these night flyers. So, how difficult is it? Well, after you've put your recorder out and you leave it on overnight, maybe it's got rechargeable batteries or you've got a charger or something. I go out in the morning, I pull out the memory card and I copy it to my laptop. pour myself a cup of tea, and I open the file up in my favorite program. This one's actually Audition, Adobe Audition, but there are other programs that are free. First thing I do is I raise the volume across the whole file, and then I start to zoom in. What you're seeing here is actually, what is this? It's like part of a 8-hour file. It's like 5 hours here. So there's no way we can actually find our birds in that size of a file. So I need to zoom in. So let me zoom in on this. So now we've got something that's maybe sort of a minute long. And as I zoom in here, I see the familiar chirping of the insects across here. This is just all insect noise. I can ignore this. I see this every night, so I know I don't worry about it. Down the bottom here, I'm not going to be recording anything in this range. This is very low end. Maybe I'll see some, this is all traffic noise, but maybe there'll be some human noises in there. Up here is where I might look for sparrows and warblers, and I won't bother looking anything up here. That's going to be a bat or something like that. It won't be a bird. But look, I've zoomed in. I see these two little check marks. They're as loud as the insects, but they're sort of floating out there. Those are actually Swainson's thrushes. It's probably actually just one bird calling in quick succession. Sometimes we'll hear a fainter call in the background, which will be a distant bird calling back to it as they're both basically winging their way from Central America to their nesting sites in the Pacific Northwest. And these are all birds that have flown over our county and would never have been detected otherwise. This is a slightly different view of a spectrogram of how it might look, but again, we've got these sparrows in this range here. We've got this across the middle here. We've got this insect noise, which we can completely ignore. But again, the sparrows kind of pop out. They're sort of lone, dark shapes. And if we zoom in even further, we can see that this savanna sparrow slopes downwards, and there's nothing that could be confused with for that. We've got some train horns here. I get used to knowing just to ignore those. We've also got some sirens here. Again, I can ignore those. And there I have Swainson's thrushes just tucked in there as well. So let's see if people can hear this, which is it's about 30 seconds of a little section from spring of 2020 from Los Feliz near the I-5 freeway. Here we go. Here we have white-crowned sparrow, which is up the top there. That's called. We're going to have another sparrow. This is a Lincoln sparrow. A little bit of a break here. And then we're coming up to these Swainson's thrushes. You're going to hear these little peeps. They're like spring peepers, they're often called. There's another one. They actually make almost like a sort of frog-like sound, and they're called the spring peeper. Now, these birds are migrating at night. They do need to be careful of owls, and in fact, we have a barn owl that loves to go through our neighborhood, so I don't know if he's catching anything, but these birds obviously have to be wary of that. A little bit of a lull now, and we've got some more migrants coming through. I think we have some more Swainson's thrushes here. There's another Swainson's. Here's another Swainson's, and then another savanna sparrow. And then back to a Swainson's thrush. We can see the marks on the screen here, and here's one coming out. This is a lazuli bunting. And those are all passerines, so now we'll mix it up. And here we have the best of the night, which is a Virginia rail coming straight in over the house, winging its way to its breeding grounds, wherever that may be. Now, I've talked a little bit about avoiding the trains, the planes, the automobiles, and the AC units and all that other human-generated noise. But there is one nocturnal flight call recording killer, and that is the northern mockingbird, which sings all night in spring, and is the bane of the existence for many recordists, because they have the same frequency range as thrushes, herons, rails, shorebirds, and then they also start mimicking the birds that are migrating over. So, you know, sometimes towards the end of the spring, they've heard so many Swainson's thrushes that they actually start doing the Swainson's thrush call. which also makes it very difficult too, because you're then trying to figure out, has the mockingbird destroyed the recording that has Swainson's thrush, or is it actually doing a Swainson's thrush? And you can usually tell it's not perfect, but it does a very good impression. It's up all night, it's hearing these birds calling as they fly over on migration. If you do eBird, there are some protocols, and I would recommend following those about how you raise the volume on your clips and have a little bit of a lead in. They do actually quite like that you have your own separate Nocturnal flight call account. You just don't use your regular account. And they also like it if you break your recordings up into hour increments. I think it's meant to be somewhat enjoyable and fun. So I think you have to obviously choose how much you want to follow some of those protocols. I'm not great at it. But just the fact that you're doing a nocturnal recording is a huge win to begin with, and I think they ought to be happy just to have that. But obviously, if you want to follow the scientific protocols, they definitely have those. And then there are, various guides and books out there. There's Peterson Guide, there's the Evans O'Brien Guide I've talked about. There's also European books. And there is also a Facebook group that's very kind to newbies, and basically everybody's a newbie at this. So you're not going to feel like you're out of your element. Everybody starts it and they always have a question, what's this, what's that? But you will find that you will start to record similar birds most nights, and you will actually get quite used to knowing, oh, that's a barn owl, Savannah sparrow, etc. There's various links here. I also have a Google sheet that I've been putting together of all the sort of LA County flight calls to potentially help people. But there are a lot of resources out there. I think basically, if you are going to try this, be patient. First few nights, don't expect anything. You can't record a few hours on your first night, expect to be filtering through scores of calls and making IDs. It's very much like regular daytime birding. 99% of the time there is nothing, but that's sort of what makes it exciting. The first couple of years I was doing this, I had no idea what I was doing. It was only with practice that you go through the files quicker, and then you start to find the birds. And some people sort of set themselves a target of, I'm going to spend no more than 30 minutes or 45 minutes going through a file. I'm not going to make sure it takes up too much of my time. And so there is that aspect where I'll try and have a cup of tea and I'll breeze through it as quickly as I possibly can, to make it somewhat more manageable and enjoyable. But sometimes it's quite exciting, to put the memory card in. You never know what you might find. You might find something crazy like a flock of whimbrels, or anything going over your house. There's a lot of stuff traveling over, and I think it would be interesting to know in different parts of LA what people are recording. I suspect if you're in Pasadena and Altadena, you're recording very different birds than what I'm recording here. And I think if you're down by the coast, where I don't believe there's anybody doing any recordings, I suspect you can find some amazing stuff and contribute greatly to our understanding of what's actually migrating through the county. So thank you. With that, I will stop my share. I think you're on mute, Travis.
Thanks. Yeah. You can actually applaud virtually. There's a little icon over on the left-hand side of the screen. If you can click on that, and that gives you your responses. There we can give the applause. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. We already have one question in the chat from Jasmine, asking, will these slides be available to us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can put them on Google or something like that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, or we
however
could,
you. Yeah, I don't know. However you.
I'm trying to think how we could. So, yeah, how we'll get it out to everybody. I think I know how to get something to Jasmine directly, but for everybody else, we'll probably we'll put it on our website somewhere, a link to it, and the video will be available.
Sorry, I'm reading the chat now. Was there people? Were you able to see the slides in the end or not?
One person had a difficulty with the slides and went over to watch it on Facebook.
And it worked there?
I believe so.
Okay.
And if anybody on Facebook would like to ask any questions, go ahead and just put it in the comments, and we'll keep an eye on that and be able to ask them. So yeah, let's open it up. Anybody else either want to put questions in the chat or turn your camera on and your mic and uh, and ask away.
Have you already done did you do a presentation on light pollution? Is that what I heard at the thing?
We did, yeah, and it's not completely coincidental. It's a topic that I work on a lot. And so we had somebody from Kyle Horton's lab at Colorado
Mm.
State who does the birdcast work, um, who talked about light pollution and how light pollution is really changing the distribution of nocturnal migrants across the landscape and drawing them away from habitat areas to ones that are potentially more dangerous.
Mhm.
And then the tower kill stuff, the communication towers is really interesting. And I'll just maybe echo a couple of things from your presentation. We did a series of papers on tower kill and using data from going back to Cochrane and Graeber that you talked about, the early days of people trying to track nocturnal migrants, and calculated that there were 6.8 million birds a year being killed at communication towers. So these are tall towers, not our local little cell towers, but tall
Mhm.
towers. And the key there, and this was Joel Gering's work out of Michigan, uh, is that it's the solid lights are the worst. If you can make it just flashing lights, you can actually reduce the
Really?
attraction to the birds by about 80%. And that was work that Joel did experimentally with communication towers in Michigan. And ultimately, people like Bill Evans and we testified in front of the Federal Communications Commission to really pressure them to change how they register communication towers and ask them to take steps to minimize this problem of birds being attracted to and killed at the communication towers. And between Joel and Bill and our sort of summary of all that work, they have changed those regulations. So now they allow them tower operators to turn off the solid lights and just have the flashing lights. And that's just a
Mm.
huge benefit to birds. Um, and I'm just vamping here a little bit because we want more questions from the audience. So go ahead and toss them in the chat. The other comment so far is we'd love to see the slides. People want to go back through this and really, I think, drink it in. The other thing I would mention is that bridge in Atwater Park. We, LA
Mhm.
Audubon, and I representing them, we commented very vociferously on that design when we first learned about it. We complained about it. We said, "This, if you want to kill birds, here's how you kill birds. You put a bunch of wires up over a very attractive habitat, and then you light it up at night." And they would not be swayed in their design, and we didn't have the uh, reserves necessarily to try to sue them over it. But I'm sorry to hear, but completely unsurprised that bridge results in a lot of near misses of birds at the river.
Yeah, seems crazy. And
Yeah,
obviously, I imagine at night it's even worse, you know. So,
yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, well, good. Let me just go over on the other side here. No comments coming in.
but
Um,
yeah, happy to put the slides up. And if anybody is mad enough to give this a try in the spring, you know, I think we're sort of beyond full migration now. I mean, you know, you probably could put something out tonight, and you probably would still get a few birds going over, but probably spring, April is the next time to try this. And if anybody wants to give it a try, they're more than welcome to reach out. I'm happy to provide some of those links. And I think it would be great to get more coverage in Los Angeles, which will really help us sort of figure out what's going on.
yeah.
Oh, there's a question here from Brenda.
Yeah. About the wavelength of birds of light. Uh, so I can take that.
Yeah, please do.
There's really contradictory evidence from around the world on that question. From Europe, there was a study that found a reduction in sort of over water, so over the ocean migrants using green light as opposed to any other color. The solid red light we know is bad. Others have found high attraction with blue light. If we look at the visual sensitivity of songbirds, they just have a very broad sensitivity to different wavelengths. And so there's unlikely to be a color that reduces attraction or collision across the board. Um, un Unfortunately. Insects, it's much easier. We know for insects, yellow and red much better than blue and violet and shorter wavelengths. White has all the wavelengths in it, so that's not great. But the key thing for tall things is the flashing versus not. Like when you have, because something that's over 50, I forget the threshold. It's either 50 or 100 feet. You have to have security lighting for airplanes. And so once you're into that zone, the solution is flashing lights as opposed to solid lights. Thanks, great question. Well, good. So we'll figure out a good way to communicate out the
Yeah,
slides, and we'll have the video up for replay on Facebook. We'll put it on our website, YouTube channel, all that kind of thing. And maybe one of you out there thinks, yeah, I've got an old iPhone and an outlet and a charger, and gonna toss a phone on your roof next April and see what you find, right? I mean, there's crazier things to do, right? There
apparently.
are. And this one you might actually contribute to our understanding of what's going on
Yeah, that's incredibly
across this
important.
this basin.
Yeah,
Really, really fascinating.
great. Well, thank
All
you.
right.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate that. I will go ahead and good night, everybody. We're going to end the